You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
This episode contains discussions of family and domestic violence. If this is triggering for you, give this one a miss. And if you need help, please call 1-800-RESPECT.
It's the early hours of Friday, April 20, and police are knocking on the door of a blue weatherboard home in Brisbane's west after reports a mother of 3 young girls has gone missing. Her husband, Gerard Baden-Clay, answers. He'd called 000 at 7:15 that morning to tell them he hadn't seen his wife, Alison, since the night before.
Police emergency, what's your location?
Hi, good morning, Brookfield. My wife isn't home. I don't know where she is.
Alison often went for a walk in the morning around 5 a.m, he told the operator. He assumed that was where she was when he woke up to an empty bed. But it was unusual she wasn't home yet. She was supposed to leave for a seminar in the city around 7.
Okay.
She's not back.
As he relays his story again to the responding officers, they're quick to notice the scratches on the real estate agent's face. A shaving injury, he tells them. Peering into his home, they're taken aback by how clean it is, like someone's made an effort to tidy up ahead of their arrival. Over the next 10 days, Gerard's story will be unravelled, exposing a double life with deadly consequences. While officers and local volunteers comb backyards, rivers and streets, police will piece together a damning case of what really happened to Alison Baden-Clay.
We really trust that the police are doing everything they can to find my wife, and we just hope that she'll come home soon. I've had no contact from her at all.
I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Mark Ainsworth, the former detective superintendent in charge of the 2012 Baden-Clay investigation, which, at the time, was one of the most high-profile investigations Queensland had ever seen. First of all, Mark, tell us about the suburb of Brookfield in Brisbane. What kind of people lived there back in 2012?
Okay, Brookfield is probably about a 15-minute drive west of Brisbane. It's sort of between Brisbane and Ipswich, and it's a lovely, I'd sort of call it a country area. Still got that country feeling about it. Very, very good community, close-knit community. There's a lot of high-end houses there as well as farming-type houses. So it's a real mixture of a community, but as I said, it's a very close-knitted community. Brookfield Showgrounds, where we had our Ford and Command post, seems to be a bit of a hub for the Brookfield area. There's horse riding schools for kids there. There's a cricket field. They have a Brookfield show every year, and it's just got a real country feel to it.
And that kind of area, it was known back then as being quite a safe, family-friendly, not much crime. Did the Baden-Clay family fit into that kind of picture from the outset of being a kind of perfect Australian family living in the outskirts of Brisbane?
100%. It's just like the family next door, just a normal family, 3 kids being raised in that environment. It's a good environment for a family to raise young children. And yeah, there was nothing untoward about their activities as seen from the outside of the Brookfield community.
When Alison Baden-Clay was first reported missing by her husband at around 7 a.m. on Friday, April 20, 2012, what did he tell the responding officers?
He'd basically told them that his wife was missing, that she'd gone out for a usual morning walk and hadn't returned home, and that he was worried about where she was. And it was just a bizarre sort of call that he'd made, pretending to be a worried husband, worried about where the wife was.
When someone goes missing, what's the process there? Are there certain circumstances that warrant like a task force to be set up or a search? Because that all happened quite quickly in Alison's case, didn't it?
It did, and it was very good work from the first responding uniformed police that went to his place. They went there, they saw the visible scratch marks on his face that looked a bit out of order. He claimed they were from a razor, but when you look at them, they certainly didn't really depict an out-of-control razor blade someone using during a shave. And just his behaviour and his answer to some of the questions, the uniformed police raised their own suspicions at that time, and contacted the Criminal Investigation Branch. So it was exceptional work at a very, very early stage by the uniformed police, which allowed the investigators to move in and do the normal course of investigation.
You were called into this investigation very early on in the piece, so the day after Alison went missing. Do you remember the first time you met Gerard? What were your first impressions?
Yeah, the first time I met him, he was very aloof towards myself. I met him at Alison's funeral again, where I went up and spoke to him, which was just an interesting concept to watch his behaviour at that funeral, knowing clearly what he had done. He at no stage at all had he inquired with myself or other police at the search area how the search was going, nor did he offer to help, nor did any of his family. Just very, very bizarre behaviour from the outset.
Speaking of the search, let's talk about that for a second, because immediately you had volunteers, you had people travelling in from Brisbane, you had police, family, neighbours. Tell us about that search in those initial days.
Okay, the search, we set up a forward command post at the Brookfield Showgrounds, and that was the centre where the search was controlled by an inspector of police who had the overall search command role. I've never seen a community come together. As I mentioned, the community was very close. Families, young kids coming up, drawings, giving food to the searching police, and the want of everyone to get involved and help. Brookfield is an area where there's, a large river area backing onto the Brisbane River, Colo Creek and creek areas around there, a lot of old gold mines, and a lot of area there where a person, if they had, fallen down or anything, could occur anywhere. Also some of the large properties. We used a lot of police, uniformed police, trained police in search. Recruits from the academy came out, Brisbane City Council, the Fire Brigade to look at some of those old disused gold mines. And the community were encouraged to search their properties as well. We also had the mounted police on motorbikes. That search was very, very intense for the whole 10-day period.
It's quite common when someone goes missing for the family to do a media press conference, to ask for anyone that might have seen anything, stuff along those lines. Was Gerard asked to be a part of that? Because he didn't appear.
He was. As a part of this, we requested him to make an appeal for Alison to come home if she'd run away or whatever, and may have been listening to any media. He refused to do that, which put Alison's parents in the predicament of having to do a media release and face questions from the media in an appeal for Alison to come home, and that was extremely stressful for both Jeff and Priscilla. They never hesitated to get up and do that, which we never had that support from the husband whatsoever.
2 days after Alison went missing, Gerard was involved in a car crash. Can you tell us about that? How did it stand out to you and the other investigators, that particular incident?
It was interesting. We'd seized his vehicles from his house. It was a Prado and a brand new Captiva that was 8 weeks old. So he'd borrowed a car from one of his friends. He was coming en route to the Indooroopilly police station where we were taking him to get a forensic medical procedure, which was an examination by a medical practitioner of the wounds on him and normal procedural medical activities. We got wind, as I can recall, that I was talking to Alison's family at the Brookfield Showgrounds when I got advised that he'd been involved in an accident. And the accident was quite interesting. It was at the Indooroopilly shopping centre, a big concrete post supporting the shopping centre, and he'd driven this car straight in to that post. There was no signs of any brake marks or anything. And when the police got there, he'd had claimed some form of injuries. But interestingly, on the front seat of the passenger seat of that car was the Courier Mail opened at page 3, which was a big article on Alison. Personally, I think whether it was attention-seeking or whether it was to do further harm to himself, but it backfired in his face a little bit in that once he was treated at the hospital, we also had him assessed for any psychiatric or mental health issues, which has a lot of significance or can have a lot of significance in any future court proceedings. And of course, that examination came back that he was of sound mind and no issues.
We talked about the scratches that were found on his face when police had their first ever meeting with him when he reported them missing. But you did also find, abrasions on his chest and some injuries on his hand. Was there any suggestion that maybe he crashed his car to try and hide some of those injuries?
Look, with Gerard, you wouldn't know. His life was full of fantasies. Trying to cover up the injuries on his face would have been a total failure because what had happened the day before, he attended a medical practice in Kenmore and had a doctor. He said that the police wanted him to examine these injuries on his face. Unfortunately for him, the female doctor that did the examination had studied over 500 razor cut biopsies during her training, and she could clearly indicate that they weren't from razors. As far as the other injuries, the scratches on his chest, he came up with a story that they were from caterpillar bites. He told police that he'd attended the cross-country running that his kids were involved in at Brookfield area the day before, and he got attacked by caterpillars, which caused him those scratches and wounds to his chest. So obviously, as part of that investigation, we engaged an entomologist to go to the actual area where the cross-country was held in an attempt for him to identify what sort of caterpillars habitated that area. Interestingly, he came back that the only caterpillars there were the ones that habitate on the ground and not fall out of trees onto people. So we were able to quickly eliminate that those injuries to his chest and rashes were not caused from a caterpillar.
In those early days, we've obviously touched on a lot of rather suspicious things coming from Gerard's kind of camp, but were there other things that had kind of already caught your attention?
Yes, there was some checks before he rang the police on the right to silence and the Fifth Amendment. He'd said that he'd been driving around the area looking for Alison on the normal route that she would walk. The other suspicions were that when the first response police arrived at Gerard's house, Gerard's father was seen to carry a vacuum cleaner out of the house and put in the boot of his car. Just his behaviours and his mannerism at the time were quite suspicious, and then by 9 o'clock the morning of the 20th, he'd engaged a solicitor, which was, again, behaviour which was very much out of character. If a husband genuinely reported the wife missing, really concerned about it, would they contact a solicitor within 2 hours of speaking to police? And that solicitor gave clear advice to the police that Gerard wouldn't be taking part in any interview and wouldn't be providing any statement. So just things along those lines. The initial search of the house, you would assume that someone with a razor injury, there might be tissues or evidence of blood or on a towel or anything in the bathroom where the shaving occurs. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. Just the general behaviour at that time, it was quite evident, as highlighted by the uniform police that first attended. Their suspicions were quite high at that first meeting with him.
10 days after Alison's disappearance, a local professor and resident went for a morning kayak not far from Brookfield. What did he find?
Yes, this man, he was kayaking up the Kilo Creek and he noticed what he thought to be a body on the muddy flats of the creek. When he went over, he confirmed that it was a female body and he'd contacted police. Interestingly, where Alison was found was in Kilo Creek, and it's a tidal creek that flows into the Brisbane River, which is probably about 200 to 300 metres downstream further. Her body was found just underneath a road bridge, Kilo Bridge. That's basically how she was found from the canoeists going up that particular part of the area.
How did you feel when her body was found? Had you been expecting this outcome by that point?
At that stage, I wasn't expecting a positive outcome in relation to Alison. We'd gone through a fair bit of heat. There was rain, the weather was different, and a person being out 10 days assumed to be in that area. I think as the days went along, the chances of finding her, in my mind, alive were not that good.
When her body was found, is that when it officially became a murder investigation?
It started off as a missing person investigation, and as the matter progressed and evidence started coming in, we'd quickly turned our mind to the matter being a possible murder investigation.
So once her body had been found, what were the next steps from your end? Obviously, you already had Gerard in your sights, but did your investigations take it up a notch, or what was your next step?
Our next step in relation to Alison's body was to see what evidence that we could find in the form of a post-mortem. Due to the state of her body after being found in that area and being there for some time, there was no cause of death identified by the pathologist. And this is where the matter became very interesting and our evidence got stronger and stronger, is that during the post-mortem, there was a number of items of foliage found in Alison's body and her hair and her arms. The pathologist managed to remove those leaves and items and secure them. And we were fortunate enough to find a botanist in Queensland by the name of Gordon Guymer, who was the head botanist. Again, fortunate for us, Gordon resided in the Bellbowrie area, which is not far from Kenmore, and had an exceptional local knowledge of that area. We got Gordon to have a look at the foliage. He was able to identify what sort of plants or trees that foliage came from. And this was a real icing on the cake moment for us. Gordon identified that 5 items of foliage were growing at the Baden Clay House at 593 Brookfield Road, Brookfield. So it added a hell of a lot of value to us, to the investigation. Interestingly, I think 4 out of 5 of those plants lined the back pergola area of the house, and Cat's Claw, which was one of them, was overhanging a carport where the Silver Captiva was parked. The Cat's Claw was dangling over the top of that carport. So we were able to put together some theories about that. So that was quite critical, that part of it. We'd also engaged a hydrologist to have a look at the water flows, the tidal flows in that area of Colo Creek, to try and eliminate any possibility that the body may have been washed down from another part of Colo Creek. As I mentioned, there's a lot of rain, and we had a lot of heavy rain leading into this period before finding Alison. And the hydrologist was clearly able to tell us that did not occur, and that her body was found above the high tide mark on Colo Creek.
And I believe you also found some blood in her car?
Yes. As a result of, back on the 20th, the scenes of crime people took over control of the house and the cars. We seized the 3 cars, one being Gerard's father's car, the Statesman, where he put the vacuum cleaner in, a Prado, and also the Captiva. When police arrived at the scene, the Captiva was reversed into the carport and a lot of kids' toys in the back of it, and didn't look out of place. We had a warrant and treated the house as a crime scene for 5 days and retained those cars and did forensic examinations in those cars. As I mentioned before, the Captiva was only 8 weeks old, so that helped us a fair bit. And a scientific examination in that car found evidence of bloodstains on the driver's side rear door of the car, which later came back to be confirmed as Alison's. So that was another significant part of the investigation. We also made some inquiries. There was a housekeeper that formerly worked at the Baden Clay's house. We spoke to her about the toys in the back of the car, and she said those toys were stacked underneath the house because the kids had outgrown using them. So obviously the toys had been removed from under the house, put into the back of the car, just to highlight the fact that it was a family car, driven purposely to take kids to and from school or play or whatever. So that was another suspicion that added up as well.
So you're really starting to paint a picture here. When did you find out that Gerard was having an affair? Was that a major point of the investigation?
There was another major part. We'd found out that the major affair he was having with this woman called McHugh, and she was a former real estate employee. And that affair had started in about 2008 and continued whilst this investigation was going on. At some stage during the search of the house, a diary was found of Alison's, and we could see that there was history between Gerard and Alison in relation to this affair. Alison had obviously found out about the affair, had spoken to Gerard, but Alison was very, very determined to get her marriage back on track and to give him a second chance. The diary was kept by her on the advice of a marriage guidance professional, and it appeared to us that she was taking it very, very serious, making notes and questions to ask of Gerard about things. During the course of the investigation, we found a covert computer set up there, including an email used by Gerard and McHugh, where they communicated to one another quite freely. And as I said, during the investigation, the relationship between McHugh and Gerard still continued. He told her to stay low until it's all over, but they could not help one another by still catching up and meeting at various places.
And the night before Alison went missing, the pair of them had a confrontation.
Yes, Gerard and Alison did. I think once Alison had found out about, the affair, she became a little bit more involved in the real estate business. The following day, on the 20th of April, Alison was to go to a real estate conference down the Gold Coast, which McHugh was attending as well. And there was an argument there about whether or not McHugh knew that Alison was going to the conference. And there was evidence found of that and presented in the court about that disagreement.
You also discovered that Gerard was in quite a lot of debt and that he had done something quite unusual with Alison's life insurance. Can you talk us through that?
That's right. Alison, she had 2 life insurance policies and a superannuation fund. Going back to the 12th of April, so 7 days before her murder, Gerard had made a phone call to one of the life insurance companies seeking information on the life insurance policy of Alison. He was not provided any information with respect to that. The 17th of April, again he tried, 2 days before her murder, to get information on the policy. On the 1st of May, before proper confirmation of Alison's identity had been released, he had a financial advisor ring the insurance company to find out about the insurance and also to notify them that a claim would be forthcoming. So we have 2 attempts before the murder and one the day after her body was found of contacting the life insurance about the policy.
Many of these revelations, particularly the affair, they were kind of untangling in front of the public via the media. As someone that was trying to investigate a crime, was that a concern for you, the media kind of getting all of these bits and pieces and publishing them while you were trying to build a case?
My view of the media is I've got a lot of respect for people in the media. There are a lot of media people that assist the police greatly in investigations, and police couldn't do it without the assistance of public messaging from the media. But we did have sections of the media that were grabbing rumours from the community and running with the rumours and printing them in the paper, which made things quite difficult. But trying to put those fires out and get the truth out there. So there were some issues with that. But the other part of looking at that too is the pressure that the media were putting on McHugh and Gerard about what they were printing or talking about was putting more pressure on them as well. Yeah, so I guess, we sort of sat back and waited for the fallout of any of that to see whether that pressure would cause any slip up between the two. McHugh had been interviewed a number of times and she was very staunch towards Gerard. And in the end, once she realised what was going on, she became more open and providing information. It's probably relevant to point out at this time that whilst McHugh was a long-standing extramarital affair, he'd also had other affairs with other women during that time as well, as we discovered during the investigation.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with former Detective Superintendent Mark Ainsworth, who led the investigation into the murder of Alison Baden-Clay. It took about 2 months or so to charge Gerard. Were there any key clues or questions that you and the team were trying to pin down or untangle before you made that arrest?
I guess the best way to talk about it, this was a very high-profile murder. Media was relentless. It never stopped in local media, state media, international and nationally. And apart from that, is we wanted to ensure that all of our I's were dotted and T's were crossed, that everything was done according to Hoyle. What we'd put into place was an independent review by people on every part of our investigation to make sure that we had done everything properly and that we had not missed anything. And that took some time. Like, we'd had over 1,500 pieces of information coming in from Crime Stoppers, and every single piece of that was run out. So we were also waiting for toxicology to come back, which takes some time to come back. Evidence, the Gordon Guymer's evidence I spoke to. So these things take a bit of time to get together. But also during that period of time, the investigation never slowed down. We utilised physical and technical surveillance skills and capabilities and a range of things to try and further enhance our evidence as we went along.
So Gerard was eventually arrested and charged on June 13. What was he being accused of in that moment? You'd painted the picture by then of what you think had happened.
He was arrested for murder and interfering with the corpse on the 13th of June 2012 as a result of all of our investigation and the evidence that we had.
What did you put to Gerard that he had done on the night that Alison was murdered?
We couldn't put anything to him because his lawyer attended the Indooroopilly police station and he refused to take part in any interview or any questions whatsoever.
So he obviously pled not guilty?
Pleaded not guilty and went through the committal proceedings. When the matter came to trial in the Supreme Court, he'd sacked his legal team from the committal matter and from his lawyer that was giving the initial advice at the scene on the day of the 20th and had a new legal team.
It did take 2 years for that trial to go ahead, and in that time, obviously, you continued your investigations. You had 500 witness statements, as you said before, 1,500 lines of inquiry. and you were leading that investigation. How would you describe the 2 years leading up to that trial?
It was very stressful. It was, as I said, the significance of the crime itself, a domestic murder, the public interest in the matter, but also, the main important factor for the investigation team was securing a conviction and putting our best foot forward with all the evidence we had, ensuring that it would withstand any challenges in the court process was number one in our mind. During that time, there was 2 bail applications made by Gerard through his legal team in the Supreme Court in Brisbane, and we were able to successfully keep him in custody. So that was a big win for us, that he was locked down in custody, and, the capability of him interfering with witnesses or potential witnesses was somewhat limited by that occurring.
So obviously, as that trial unfolds over those few weeks, that's the public's opportunity to really find out what happened. What picture did the prosecution paint?
I believe the prosecution painted a very clear picture of Gerard's personality, his way of life, the way he treated Alison and the 3 kids during that time, mostly Alison, that she was very much a stay-at-home wife and manipulated by anything that he wanted. I think they painted a very clear picture that he was in diabolical financial difficulties, that the affair with McHugh had been ongoing, and that he'd made promises to McHugh on a number of occasions that he would be with her as from the 1st of July 2012, once he'd sorted out his financial problems. Most of the evidence we had was circumstantial, but I'd say very, very strong circumstantial evidence. And I think the way the prosecutor combined all that evidence together to paint the picture, and with the calling of those witnesses, painted a clear picture to the jury of what we believe to be the case of what happened. Interestingly, Gerard elected to jump the witness box, which is very much unheard of for these sort of matters. And he was in the witness box for a number of days, and sitting there watching him give his evidence, I don't think he did himself any favours.
Can you tell us what the court was told about what happened to Alison?
The court was basically told that, they'd been in a relationship for a period of time. They'd met working together at the Flight Centre, where Gerard had moved on and became involved in real estate, that Alison was a successful and intelligent lady. She was a former Miss Brisbane, could speak 5 languages, and was very successful in her business at the Flight Centre. They were married and rented a house at 593 Brookfield Road, Brookfield, for 14 years, and Gerard was running a somewhat unsuccessful real estate business in that area. They presented about the extramarital affairs, about his financial predicament that he was in. They presented the solid evidence of the forensic team, from finding the bloodstains of Alison in the Captiva, Gordon Guymer's evidence, the evidence of the caterpillar, the entomologist, and also other evidence that we had put together as part of the investigation, particularly about the razor cuts on the face and a whole range of things along those lines. Now, I mentioned earlier on with respect to peer review of our evidence, we were fortunate there was a human error made by the pathologist in relation to toxicology, with 1 decimal point being put in the wrong area, which indicated prior to correction that Alison had a high level of antidepressant medication in the system. And as a result of that peer review by Australia's leading pathologist, we were able to put that correct, and the decimal point was put in the correct place, which just showed a very, very minimal level. I remember in Gerard's evidence, he honed in that Alison was suffering from mental illness and depression, and was just trying to unload everything onto Alison, which we were able to disprove.
Were you able to work out an exact timeline of that night?
No, we know that she was definitely, we got footage of her being at the Kenmore Hairdressers at 6:30pm, getting her hair done in preparation for the real estate conference the next day. He said that he'd gone to bed about 10 o'clock and she was watching the footy show on TV. But again, that's only his word. And as we found out all the way through this, his word was just a continuity of lies. So I firmly believe that Alison was killed on the night of the 19th and that her body was disposed at Colo Creek either late on the 19th or early hours of the 20th of April.
Would you describe the relationship prior to the murder as being a domestically or emotionally abusive relationship, or both?
I would suggest emotionally and very coercive, controlling. During the interview there, we found out that Alison had never gone for a walk in the morning. It wasn't one for exercise. She was restricted severely financially for the activities of the kids who were involved in dancing and other things there. Gerard would never ever take Alison to any of the Chamber of Commerce functions or meetings. He was heavily involved in the Kenmore Chamber of Commerce. She was never allowed to attend them, never allowed to attend real estate meetings. Alison's from was one of three kids of the Dickies, but the Dickies come from a large family. Whenever Baden Clays would go to family functions, Gerard was always there, keen to get her out of the place as soon as they could. One thing from this is that Alison seemed to be a very private person, and while she had some very, very close female friends around, very close parents, she never spoke about what was occurring in her private life to the extent of any coercive control or emotional or physical abuse.
Did her diaries shed any light on that, though?
The diary does. The diary indicated a lot of emotional control. She poured out her feelings about the affair and his attitude towards her feelings, and it pointed out to me very little evidence of support from Gerard of her, and very much a matter of fact, well, this is what happened, you know.
So after a month-long trial and 5 days of deliberations, on the 15th of July 2014, what did the jury decide?
Jury came back with a verdict of guilty, and that was to the charge of murder, which was quite a satisfying outcome for the family and for the police and friends, everyone involved in the matter.
Was that satisfying to you as well, to get that sentence of life in prison?
It certainly was. We'd put a lot of work into this. There was a hell of a lot of pressure from day one on this. I said significant media interest, and I'd grown pretty close to Alison Dickey's family, and just seeing the pressure that they were going under as well. Managing the three kids, they became parents to Alison's three girls, looking after that, sheltering them away from media commentary about the murder. But just the immense pressure on Jeff and Priscilla and the family and friends about wanting to get a successful outcome. And that I know the investigators and myself sort of take that responsibility very, very seriously. And it does impact on every day of that trial. Is there anything more we could have done? Have we done everything best? And then when the jury were out for 5 days, it was a long time. And when they came back with that verdict, it was particularly satisfying.
But it wasn't the end of this story, because Gerard appealed his sentence and conviction. What happened there? Can you walk us through it?
Okay, what happened after that? He appealed his conviction because the matter was a serious matter in the Supreme Court. It went to the Court of Criminal Appeal, and that court considered all the evidence and submissions and overturned the conviction for murder to one of manslaughter, which would have been a reduced penalty. And it was something that I don't think is seen too often, is the influence of the public and a number of Alison's friends, bringing in media personalities and organising a rally, trying to encourage the Attorney-General in Queensland to appeal the criminal court's process of coming back to the manslaughter. There was a rally held in King George Square, everyone dressed in yellow, which was Alison's favourite colour, a number of high-profile media people there leading the charge. And it gathered quite a lot of momentum in the community about appealing this decision further. The Attorney-General made a decision to lodge an appeal in the High Court of Australia, and that appeal was heard. And after submissions from prosecution and also from Gerard's legal representatives, the High Court judges came back 5-0 in favour of the murder charge standing, and that was reinstituted, which again was very, very stressful for the family and friends having to go through this over a lengthy period of time.
It would have been stressful for you as well. You worked so hard on this case, and then to see a decision reversed that you had put so much effort into making sure stuck. Did it make you reflect on our justice system at all, especially when it comes to cases like this or domestic violence, murder kind of cases?
I think, obviously there's a lot of concern from us, and read through the judgment quite a bit. Didn't necessarily agree with some of the findings, and that was supported by the High Court judges. I felt personally gutted and felt like I'd personally let people down by that occurring. Yeah, but as I said, the High Court overturned it, and it stood to where it should have stood all the way along. in my view.
Do you think that there's anything we can learn from this case, from how we could have supported Alison or, in the aftermath of the court case? Is there anything we can learn as a society, as a justice system?
Look, I think the big thing is support for people. I'm not only talking, from the victim, but also the family of the perpetrator. They're heavily, involved in this as well. I think, since Alison's matter came in, domestic violence, it occurred before that, but I think domestic violence is on the national agenda now well and truly. I've got my own personal views about it. We look at the police. Now, the police react. They've got to keep the peace. They react to a call of domestic violence. They go to a residence and they're faced with, what they can and what they can't do in the bounds of legislation. The police have undergone an enormous education process as domestic violence has progressed along. We've seen coercive control come in recently in legislation and a huge education process with that. The other thing that we've seen is a number of organisations within the community, some government-funded, some self-funded, that are all working towards the same end goal to deal with domestic violence because it's such a probably number one, number two issue in our country at the moment. One thing I see is that, we've just recently had appointed federally a person to look after domestic violence. We've got various groups in Queensland under government here, and I'm sure New South Wales have the same. But I think we haven't seen a reduction in domestic violence murders or serious injuries for people involved in domestic violence. I think what we really need to see is some of these agencies that act independently but are trying to achieve the same thing. There needs to be a combining of all their resources, all the funding, to have a big pool where the community can get the most benefit out of it. I see it as a whole of community problem. Education plays an extremely important part of this. Now, I know the Alison Baden Clay Foundation, which was set up at the request of Jeff and Priscilla Dickey, looked at education in schools, but how do we further that education? Giving people safe havens, someone to talk to there and then, it's a massive problem. But I think ownership has got to go to the individuals themselves as well. They play a significant part in it. And I think the court process is another one that we need to look at properly, and that's supporting victims' families through the traumas of court matters and reliving what their loved one has been through. How do we do that? I'm uncertain.
You obviously became really close to Alison's family and to her loved ones. You were so involved with the case. I know that you have since retired from the Queensland Police Force after 38 years, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
Is this case something that's left a lasting mark on you?
It certainly has. And I think what's happened in this one is getting to know Alison's family and friends very, very closely. Watching the three girls, who were 10, 8 and 5 at the time this happened, watch them grow up and turn into remarkable young ladies, considering what they've been through. They lost their mother. They've really lost their father. Not having the support of mum and dad there to watch them, graduate from school, graduate from uni, do the dance and all the successes that these three girls have achieved, but also seeing the way that, their grandparents and close family friends have gathered around the girls to make sure they have the best and the ability to have the best of life. And I think it's been absolutely amazing that the way that's occurred. And unfortunately, not every other family has that support around them. So domestic violence has no winners. It's not only the two people involved or three people involved, but it's the families and close friends. How do they survive? How do they move forward?
Mark Ainsworth is a former detective superintendent in the Queensland Police Service with over 38 years' experience. In that time on the force, Mark was involved in some of the state's biggest criminal investigations, including the murder of Alison Baden Clay in 2012. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Gemma Barth, and my executive producer is Gia Moylan. If you enjoyed this episode of True Crime Conversations, let us know. You can send an email to truecrime@mamamia.com.au or leave us a review on your favourite podcast app to help other true crime fans discover our work.